acute need for homelessness. So I know we've seen people in the homeless shelter that ended up there because their furnace broke and they couldn't afford to repair it. We've seen people that are currently employed that have to use shelter services for a period of time. We've seen individuals that had lived at one location for a very long time. The location was sold, they were evicted so the landlord could renovate. They couldn't afford the new rent and they're then homeless. So we have all these different processes that are moving people towards homelessness. And when we look at the numbers, that's, to me, one of the capacity issues when we first made the decision was not only were we going to end up with 20 or so people immediately living rough and immediately into homelessness, but when we looked at the rate of people becoming homeless versus the rate of getting them into supportive housing, we weren't going to be catching up. That number was going to be growing of frank homeless people, and I think that really necessitated a bigger building with more capacity.
Which is what we're obviously doing, right? So you've got the people in all those categories, but the challenge is what comes with it is people on the fringe of those categories that have the drug issues, the mental issues, and it's all kind of they're all moving in out of the area. Right?
It's a challenge when you look at the differences between the emergency shelter that's run municipally is a program. So it's a program to get people back into housing. You have to call and get into that program. You have to follow certain rules as people would expect in those situations. Not everyone's ready for that step. When you compare that to a drop-in shelter that's run in different communities, usually by community groups, there's not the same type of rules. And sometimes, that's a challenge for people that are vulnerable as well. They say, well, maybe I'm not ready to get into housing. I just want a bed to sleep in tonight. They're still going through some things. And different services are needed for individuals with that experience. So, there's different structures and different ways that shelters are run, and it's there's a pretty significant difference between an emergency shelter that's a program to put people back in housing versus a drop-in shelter and the associated challenges you see with those.
Yes, understood, 100%. Thank you. Where were we? Would you recommend councillors and municipal staff consult with residents on the impact of shelter and spread the encampments in this neighborhood in order to find solutions?
Yeah, I think it's really important to work with community partners. It's important to work with residents. It's important to work with anyone that's working in that space already and anyone that's impacted. We've talked about how encampments have spread, and we know the impact that those can have at times. And we also know that when an encampment's broken up and people have to find a new place to stay, that also presents a lot of challenges. We need to engage with as many people as we can to look at the types of solutions, the type of acute solutions we can use right now. And I think it's also important at that when we're doing that is to build some support for those really sort of broader things that are going to start making some impacts. So talking about the fact that we legislate people into poverty, when we talk about that, people are often really surprised to learn how low those levels of support are, and when they compare them to costs in the community, it's pretty obvious why homelessness is happening. To talk about the reality.
When we're talking about costs, is it incorporated what it costs the police for increased calls to the neighborhood? Is it incorporated, operational costs, fire, police, paramedics, cost of park staff to clean up after encampments? Like, is all that part of the equation in terms of what you guys are looking at?
Yeah. So homelessness is an expensive issue. So if you think about just emergency services, police, fire, EMS. It's not a municipal purview, but hospital services. People living rough are vulnerable, and they're experiencing health outcomes that are difficult and require services. And it's a from a humanity perspective, it's awful. Financially, it's very expensive.
So is that looked at though? Do they look at the cost increases of police? If you've got police that are staffed, just to pick one, right?
Yep.
So you got cops that are staffed, and they get 15 calls in the neighborhood versus 5.
Yes.
Right, or what the real numbers would be from last year to this year would be 10 versus 5.
Yeah, so you can get those reports. I know, particularly in the downtown areas and where the patrol areas go, you can look at like number of calls and associated costs. And I think what would be really interesting is.
Would you recommend councillors and municipal staff consult with residents on an impact from the shelter? So would you recommend that the councillors have a communication system with the neighborhood to help solve all of these issues? Like, is there anything in place aside from this kind of thing, or is there, like, what do you have in place and what can we put in place so that people actually feel like they have a voice and that the councillors can get some, because there's some good ideas coming out of this neighborhood.
For sure, and I think that there's some good examples of where that's worked really well. So we think about in Bothwell, They have an organization that talks about recreation in that community and how they can better use their arena and funnels a lot of ideas back to council that's really helpful. Obviously, in the past, we've seen Eastside Pride, Councillor Crew's original organization that did an awful lot of work, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for communities to organize, because at the end of the day, community organization, grassroots movements, that's how we make change in communities, and I think there's obviously a lot of passion and care in this community to do something like that, so I think there's an opportunity to formalize that a little bit. I know that there's some community meetings starting, and I think those can be facilitated in a way to start to provide some feedback and two-way conversation as well. What that exactly looks like, that's up to community members to a degree. How they want to design their meetings. Do they want people there right away? Do they want interaction with staff members, or do they want to get some ideas themselves and formulate and then have those conversations? So there's tremendous opportunity there, and I think it's worked on a lot of other issues, and it has potential to work. And I think one of my takeaways from the community meetings was there was a lot of issues that people were feeling very strongly about that had been happening.
Which meetings are you talking about?
The community meetings just after the shelter approval.
Okay, yeah.
At Studio One. People were bringing a lot of concerns that were long-standing concerns that they had within their communities, within Chatham Kent as a whole, and that was really an opportunity to hear more about some of those things that maybe weren't funneling back the way they should be, and some of those frustrations, and talk about where we can work together for some better solutions.
Okay, good, thank you. So we know the lease at the shelter location is being defined by the municipal staff as finite, right? So we know it's supposed to end.
Yeah. I think I said finite on Monday.
I think you did it. That might be where this question came from. There seems to be a reluctance to say exactly how the lease is going to end. How it's going to end, where it's going to move, what's going to happen, right? So in a perfect world, what we'd like to see is, okay, so we're 6 months after the emergency shelter, we know we've got 2.5 years left, and we've got our eyes set on 6 properties, and and this is how we're raising the money for the budget, and this is who we're, and I think that what we want is some transparency moving forward, so that it just doesn't turn into, oh, by the way, now the cultural center's empty because they're going to build something downtown. Guess what? Right? So what do we have coming in there?
Yeah, so I think that's part of the reason I brought those questions up Monday night, is to say, okay, we've had this breather, we've got our feet under us after 100 days, operations are going. What are we doing to look at next steps? So and that's why I use that word finite. In my mind, it's a finite lease. Obviously, the ideal is that we start to make some headway on getting back to those housing first models, getting people into housing more quickly than people are becoming unhoused, and go back to a model where we don't need an emergency shelter anywhere. I think some of the language gets a little bit confusing, because municipally it's very much viewed as a program. So when we think about shelter, we think about building, and I think a lot of times when we think about the operations, we think about the program. So I think we're always going to need programming that supports people and tries to move them into the various stages of housing. So the way that's funded and the way those supports look, that's going to change over time, but it's not going to disappear. So you're not going to wrap up all the services the day you throw the close sign on and say, well, we don't need to do this anymore. You're going to need to do it. The lease will run out, and we're going to need to do it in a different space or differently. Hopefully we can go back to the model that we were using before that I think was working a lot better, which was utilizing motel rooms and other forms of transitional housing, and then getting people into these other supportive forms of housing. What we need to see is those investments start to pick up in those types of housing. We're going to see shortly some reports coming back about investment in those supportive types of housing that I think are going to make a big impact. We talked about the indwell development, we talked about tiny homes. So
are there grants for that kind of thing from the government? Just like the provincial government or federal government, is there grants for that kind of building?
So there are in some ways. So obviously the federal government has housing initiatives that fund some types of housing. The provincial government has different funding programs. When you look at a lot of the builds that have happened in Chatham Kent, they're generally going to be some type of mixed funding. So all that money gets put into one pot. So you can look at one building and say, oh, this was federally funded, this building was municipally funded. It's not really. It's all this money that's gone into a pot from the federal government, provincial government, municipality, and then as those projects become available, they're built, or in some cases renovated. We've got a huge backlog in even just renovating existing properties as well. That's not a Chatham Kent alone problem. That's not an Ontario-wide problem. So we know that there's some pretty significant.
So if you're going to renovate a property, let's say that's been
Yeah.
vacant for 2 or 3 years,
Yeah.
you know, you're gonna renovate it. Is there a grant that you can go to for the government to help you if you have a decreased rent, if you have a lower rent for low-income people?
Yeah, so generally, a lot of those, a lot of different forms of housing are partnerships with private organizations. So they are in the business of making affordable housing or making geared to income housing. Those RFPs go out, so wherever they're funded through the municipality, province, federal government, municipality puts the RFP out, those are responded to by these types of organizations. Then they access those funds to do their builds.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not enough, to be frank. Those numbers that of investment from the federal government or the provincial government, they're not enough. They need to increase.
So they're not enough for private investors to go out and build low-income
So-
places and still survive?
So they're enough to get them done. They're not enough to get enough of them done. So I mean, the builds are happening. So we see them like on Dolson, and we've seen some other builds recently. The one just off Queen Street there. So they're happening, but they're not happening at a rate that's quick enough to address the shortage of housing. So those wait lists that we talk about are still growing. They're still too long, really, to have the meaningful impact we need on homelessness.
Okay.
So we need to see more investment. That's, you know, it's not more complicated than that. The funds that are out there are getting spent. We need that amount of money to increase, and we also all know the inflationary pressure, and not just regular inflation, but inflation on building products and on building itself. We've seen how much more expensive it is to build things or renovate things just in the past couple of years. So that funding has to not only pace that amount, but it needs to exceed that amount so we can start making headway.
Good, thank you. As a member of council,
Yep.
thinking about this being finite down here,
Yep.
would you be willing to sign an agreement stating that the shelter will close or move from its present location on or before May 31st, 2025?
Yeah, so I could say what my preference is and what I will do. You know, understanding the way council works, there's 18 votes around that table. I can't guarantee what anyone else is going to do. I can say what I will do, and you know, in my mind, that lease is finite. I want to push us towards those housing first models again. I won't stop advocating for things like increase in ODSP rates, increase in OW rates, harm reduction, these other things that are going to make an impact. I hope more people will start doing that. I fully expect that the end of this lease is going to require a transition, and that transition is going to be back to the housing first model or to a different location. I've talked to members in this community in particular and said how I expect to see that happen, whether or not I'm on council. You know, I expect that process is going to be, well, it's already started, talking about next steps, but at least 12 months out to 6 months out, I think we need to have a really finite plan about what that end date looks like.
Why wait that long?
Well, no, the work has to continue that whole time, but
Yeah. But I mean, you're hoping it's going to go back to what it was before. But you and I both know, and everybody in town knows, that we're importing people. We've got homeless people all over town. So if we've got a serious issue,
Yep.
why are we waiting till 6 months before? Why aren't we looking for? Okay, this is the next phase. It's not going to go back to what it was before.
So-
right, because we've got 10 times as many people here
Yeah.
who are homeless, right?
So I'm not saying we wait until 12 to 6 months to start the process.
Right.
The process has already started. People need to be tracking numbers. We need to be looking at what types of services are going to be available. If it's going to be a property, we need to have an inventory of what's coming available or what is currently available.
Mm-hmm.
We need to look at what the assessed need might be, trying to track those predictors and say, are we seeing more need? Are we seeing that start to slow down and plateau? Are we seeing motels and hotels that we had traditionally used? Are they starting to have availability to use more like we used to? So we need to be tracking those things over time. And what I'm saying with the 12 to 6 month window is when we get to that 12 month from the end of the lease, we need to have a really good idea of what the next step
You have a
is.
plan, right?
Yeah,
You have
exactly.
a plan.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
because that's the
Yeah.
nightmare, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing happened because there was no plan,
Yeah, and
right?
and part of it really happened with this really difficult process of doing a community scan, not finding what's available that's really required and needed. And I think recognizing how challenging that was that time, we know that work needs to start really quickly, and we need to have a really good idea of what's available, what's needed, what programs are going to be out there, and how we can make this work for our community.
You understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
When we talk about the travel lodge and
Yeah.
losing the account of the travel lodge to take
Yeah.
care of the homeless, I mean, how long did we know that was coming up?
Yeah.
Was it 3 days?
So we knew how long the lease was. I remember talking about it in, I'm going to say November for sure,
Mhm.
and that's why the report came back in December around the. So sort of inventory of municipal assets. So doing the scan
Right.
of, hey, what do we already own? Are any of these buildings going to
So
work?
that's what when you said
Yeah.
6 months, when I go to write, okay, well, that sounds like about 6 months. Because
Yeah,
December to
so that's-
June is 6 months.
that's
and
why I say
when you
12
said
months,
we
yeah.
need, we need
Yeah.
to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and,
Right.
and I think we have a better idea of the challenges that are faced when doing that. So it's unfortunately not as easy as going and buying a car and saying, hey, here's what we need. We can pick one out of the lot. There's a
Yeah.
very finite number of, if it is a structure that we need, a very finite number of buildings that are available for lease, buildings that meet the requirements that are needed, that frankly we have funding for to fix. So that's a big component. I think understanding those challenges and understanding the challenge of communication and prior planning, I think that process needs to start a lot earlier, and be really well engaged and well thought out as we get closer to that time period.
And what about communication?
Yeah, so I think part of those interim reports and getting information reports and making sure they get highlighted and having counselors ask those questions, which we all have the ability and accountability to do. We need to see those mile markers and understand how this issue is changing in our community. We'll have some good data around numeration reports and counting homelessness that provide some data, but really talking about, okay, where are we at in this process? Are we seeing more of an ability to move people into transitional housing? If these other developments open, like Indwell, what impact does that have immediately? And then predicting how that's going to look in the community and how that's going to impact service provision over time is important.
Yeah, so I guess it makes sense to have all that information. But,
Yeah.
but there's a part of me that's just screaming out. It's saying, okay, great, we have that information. At 2.5 years,
Yeah.
it would be nice to have something in the paper or in like a public forum
Yeah.
saying, okay, well, these are the houses, these are the places we're
Yeah.
looking at, these are the plans we have,
Mhm.
input here if you have ideas. And then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you got a community that's involved.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so now I've got 5 possible properties. I'm 2.5 years out. We know we've got 2.5 years.
Yeah.
The deadline's coming, folks.
Yeah.
All right, winter's coming. We know it's
Yeah.
coming, right? It comes every year. Well,
Yeah.
so then how can we do that? Is
Yeah.
that something that you'd be willing to commit to?
Yeah,
That kind of
and
communication.
that's part of the reason I asked those questions on Monday night.
Yeah.
We hadn't had it.
So you get the answers
Yeah.
to those questions at council, and I
Yeah.
understand that that's
Yeah.
all public forum.
Yeah.
But people don't go to YouTube to watch it very often. So
You
how
tell
do
me not everyone watches council.
I watch it occasionally. There's a couple
Yeah.
people that are interested just at certain times, right?
Yeah.
But so how do we get that
Yeah.
information to the public who are going to be outraged when the next time this happens?
Yeah.
It's going to be, well, why were we informed 3 days before the vote
Yeah.
happened, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
that's the question in my mind every time
sure.
this kind of stuff comes
And,
up.
and I think there's some opportunity to do that through, we've seen some improvement in engagement, specifically recently, using things like CK Let's Talk, which is an online portal to submit ideas and comments and concerns. So I think that there's an opportunity to say, okay, we're operating now. We've kind of found our feet with the transition. As we're looking for these next stages and deciding on what our goalposts are, when we're reporting back, what those information reports are going to look at, and what's the community engagement piece going to be. Let's make sure that we're posting those on CK Let's Talk. Let's make sure we're talking about them. Hopefully the media finds this a very interesting issue. I think they do now. So
Some of us
hopefully
do. I'm starting to call myself that. So we might be doing more videos. I don't know.
So hopefully there's that opportunity that people are thinking about it more often. And I think outside of just the issue of the shelter, I'm hoping that people are going to start recognizing the vulnerability in our community, going to start recognizing the lack of support that we see, and are going to start to really take seriously that things I've talked about and advocating for ODSP and OW rates that meet and are not below the level of poverty. That people are going to start advocating for increase from other levels of government in affordable housing and social housing supports, because those are the things we need. And that passion that we see in the community, there's a great direction to funnel that passion towards these types of real, tangible changes that can be made in policy that are going to impact our community and communities all over Ontario. So I think that I'm really hopeful. I see great volunteerism in the community. Through all these community organizations that are working in the space, I see more people talking about it now. I think we're going to see more energy towards those things. And as we can talk about these real solutions, I think we can start pushing and actually see them happen at other levels of government as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, moving right along. Homelessness is not unique to Chatham-Kent. Communities across the country are struggling with problems that lead to homelessness and finding the support services and resources necessary to help people. What do you think are the leading causes? We've probably covered it, but let's just go back to it for a second. What do you think the leading causes to homelessness here are?
Yeah, so in the reports that we've seen and the data that's collected, the acute cause, the leading acute cause is breakdown of families. So thinking about relationships changing and family dynamics, that's what can push someone that's already...
Where does that data come from, Brock?
That data comes from enumeration reports, so that's when they count homeless populations, go and talk to them and ask those types of questions. They record those types of data.
So a couple breaks up, they've got kids go with one,
Yep.
other parent
Can't afford rent.
can't afford to maintain.
Yeah. Or you think about abusive relationships. You think about that can sometimes be young people that are maybe asked to leave their home or no longer have a safe place to stay in their family home. They're looking for another option.
And that's the number. So family breakup is the number one cause. So
Yeah.
we haven't had that answer yet. That's interesting.
Yeah. So
it's always a loose answer around drug issues and mental health.
and I mean, obviously
that's going to be part of it. Obviously,
those things are complex too, right? So, and I think that, and we already talked a bit about it when we talk about these generational, very long-standing issues, marginalization of people, stigmatization. We talk about, experiences of trauma. We talk about groups that are overrepresented in homeless populations, indigenous groups. We talk about LGBTQ groups that are overrepresented as well. There's obviously vulnerability, the experience of trauma, maybe a varied access to services that leads people to being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes, one bad break to end up in a really difficult place.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, people are only a couple months away from it. Just the average person is 2 to 3 months away from homelessness. We've talked about how you'd handle homelessness, and I feel like you've covered that very well and given us a lot of good information. Thank you for that. And so at September 12th council meeting, we heard that since opening the shelter on Murray Street almost 4 months ago, 110 individuals and families were admitted at the location. 31 have been moved to housing. I thought it was 79. Is it 31 or 79?
Yeah, and I have to look back at the number, but we discussed it on
Paul, do you recollect?
Yeah, there was a little bit of a blurring between overall housing that they placed and specifically the Murray Street location.
Okay, yeah.
So if I read things right, there were 110 people serviced at the Murray Street location.
Yeah.
There were 31 of those people who ended up moving on to some kind of sustainable housing at that point.
Okay, so of that, so then that leaves then roughly 80 people.
Yeah.
Right, 80 people. So are they still at the Murray Street shelter, those 80 people who have been...
So I think that count may also be people that receive services and maybe aren't still staying there anymore. So however that count goes, because it's not quite at capacity right now from my understanding, so they do have space for a few more people. I know
so there can't be 80 people there then?
So there wouldn't be 80 people there, yeah. As we kind of talked, the challenge is that in and out. So if we were talking about a static, there's 60 homeless people in Chatham-Kent, we need to find 60 people homes and the issue goes away, that would be an easy fix. But unfortunately that's not the issue. We have people becoming homeless at a rate that exceeds the ability of us to get them into transitional or supportive housing, and that's when that group continues to grow. So that's the real challenge. And I think as we see these other projects come on board, hopefully we see some availability of the traditional spaces we used for housing individuals become available. We can decrease that number and start to move back to that housing first model, because really this is a program, not a building. We're trying to get people into housing, and really that's where they should be. Okay,
thank you. That makes sense. What's the plan for helping homeless people who don't qualify for the shelter?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I know we talked a little bit about recent encampments and employment and social services going out, engaging with those folks and saying, hey, here's what we can offer, here's how you access the shelter if you're ready for that. And we do have some great community organizations that are out there doing that work as well. You think about Rock Missions that is out there, every day contacting people, making sure that they still know that there's people out there ready to help, and when they're ready to make that step to get into the shelter or to get into another form of housing, there's going to be supports there. So a lot of it's constant contact. So people are at different stages of their experience. Some of them aren't ready for those commitments yet, but we certainly need to be there as soon as they are, and we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to reduce harm in the meantime. So offering those supportive services, making sure people are safe, and that's a real challenge. There's a lot of people doing great work in that area. We're going to see that expanded. We talked a little bit about bringing on a community partner to deliver those services within the community as well. So I think that's going to have some impact, but at the end of the day, we need to keep that contact fresh. We need to make sure we're talking to people, listening to their needs, and doing what we can to help them prepare for that next stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Brock, it's been a pleasure. I
Yeah, thanks for having me.
appreciate you coming
Yeah.
down. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say to people, Chatham Kent, that have been watching this, to say,
Yeah,
you
just
know, about your re-election, about your plans? You've said a lot. And
Yeah, yeah.
The thing is, you're defined.
yeah.
Right, so I feel like we've walked away from this conversation knowing what you stand for.
No, and I think that's really important, and I think it's it's really important that we can have conversations as communities, and sometimes they're going to be really difficult, and there's going to be really difficult decisions around council tables. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about transparency and accountability, a lot of that rests back on us, and we need to do a good job of engaging with people, talking with people, and I'm glad to come here and be able to do that. I do my best to answer as many phone calls about issues just like this as I can, and I hope that that honest and open communication is something that community values, and I really hope that this issue has really focused the light on something that's been going on in community for a long period of time and getting worse, and that we can start working as a community to not only deal with what's happening acutely, but really start advocating for those solutions to other levels of government and say, hey, we're experiencing this here, it's happening all over Ontario, we know some of the solutions, we need better partners on board from the province and the federal government to get social housing built, to decrease the affordability issue that's rising in our community, and to not legislate people into poverty, because at the end of the day, we know there's solutions to these issues. It's a matter of political will. We need to push people to do it, and that's going to benefit our community.
Thank you very much, Brock.
Thank you.